Perhaps the best example of Jackson's idea of limited federal government emerged from the clash over the second bank in the United States. Under the directorship of Nicholas Biddle, the bank had fully recovered from the panic of 1819 and had become a strong institution that facilitated business expansion and provided a stable currency. Many Americans, however, continued to oppose the idea of a national bank. Some felt that it restricted their economic opportunities. Others believed that it was unconstitutional, and yet others felt that the bank was a powerful monopoly controlled by a few wealthy men, and that this highly centralized power over the economy was counter to the country's democratic traditions. President Jackson was one of those who was deeply opposed to the bank. Originally chartered in 1816 for a term of 20 years, the bank's leadership decided to try to seek an early renewal in 1832. This decision was made in part because of politics. Henry Clay, who hoped to run against Jackson in the 1832 election, wanted to make the bank his central issue. Friends of the bank held a majority in Congress, and he believed that Jackson would lose support if he vetoed the recharter. The supporters of the bank, however, failed to grasp the depth of popular prejudice against the bank. Their plan backfired and essentially handed Jackson a juicy election year topic. When Congress issued the recharter, Jackson vetoed it with a ringing denunciation of monopoly and special privilege. The bill, he argued, demonstrated that, quote, many of our rich men have not been content with equal protection and equal benefits, but have besought us to make them richer by act of Congress, unquote. Not satisfied with simply denying the recharter of the bank, Jackson moved to strip it of the federal deposits that constituted a large portion of its capital. He redistributed these funds to state and local banks, primarily to those that supported the Democratic Party. Many people were unhappy with Jackson's actions. His own Treasury Secretary refused to comply with his instructions, believing that it was a financially unsound move. The president promptly fired him. Within Congress, opponents charged that Jackson was acting in a despotic manner. Senator Henry Clay declared that, quote, we're in the midst of a revolution, hitherto bloodless but rapidly tending towards a total change of the pure Republican character of the government and to the concentration of all power in the hands of one man. In a term of 8 years, the government will have been transformed into an elective monarchy, the worst of all forms of government, unquote. Nicholas Biddle, the head of the Bank of the United States, decided to take direct action. Using the still tremendous financial power of his institution, he contracted the money supply of the United States, causing an economic panic. Business and political leaders, frightened by the financial collapse, flocked to the president's office, begging him to relent. Jackson refused, pointing out that Biddle's ability to so easily damage the American economy in pursuit of a political agenda simply confirmed what he had been arguing all along, that the bank had too much power. With these actions, Jackson had destroyed, for better or worse, a key mechanism by which the federal government sought to regulate and stimulate the national economy. It was a clear triumph of Jeffersonian principles of limited government over Hamiltonian ideals of expansive government. Jackson was similarly decisive in using his power to resolve an issue that had long troubled the Republic, the status of Native Americans. While not citizens, Native Americans continued to reside within the boundaries of the United States and to claim rights as sovereign nations. In some cases, these tribes had evolved considerably in an effort to accommodate themselves to American society. This was particularly evident among the so-called 5 civilized tribes of the South, which included the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminoles. Amongst these, the Cherokee had gone the furthest in adopting the ways of the white man. By the 1820s, they had created a system of government which included a written constitution. They began publishing a newspaper in their own language and adopted American-style agriculture, including the use of slavery. The United States Supreme Court affirmed that the tribes had some rights under the Constitution. In 1828, the state of Georgia extended its laws over tribal lands, insisting that the treaties signed with the federal government were essentially meaningless. The Federal Supreme Court, in the case of Worcester v. Georgia, 1832, contradicted this assertion. Samuel Worcester was a Christian missionary who had gone to live among the Cherokee. The state of Georgia arrested him, charging that he needed a special license from the state to reside on native lands. The Supreme Court rejected this assertion of state power, indicating that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political entity, not subject to state laws. Jackson, however, insisted upon the removal of the tribes. His interpretation of the Constitution was quite different from that of the courts, and he was concerned that allowing the tribes to remain in settled areas would endanger the security of the country. He also recognized the eagerness of many state governments to acquire title to Indian lands. In 1830, Congress, at Jackson's urging, passed the Indian Removal Act. This measure promised the tribes new territory west of the Mississippi in exchange for their lands in the settled regions of the United States. Some of the tribes quickly agreed, recognizing that state governments would not relent in pressuring them, and that the federal government, under President Jackson, would not protect them. In other cases, government negotiators used fraudulent methods to obtain agreements. The Cherokee, for instance, lost all their lands when a small portion of the tribe, not authorized to act for the entire Cherokee Nation, signed a treaty. When a large number of the Cherokee refused to leave, the federal government sent troops to remove them. Many Cherokee did not survive the long forced trek to the Indian country, a tragic migration that became known as the Trail of Tears. The Seminoles suffered a similar tragedy when they decided to stay and fight. After a long, bloody conflict that lasted for years, they too were forced to relocate. Not all Americans agreed with Jackson's policies. As one military officer wrote, speaking of the conflict with the Seminoles, quote, "The government is in the wrong, and this is the chief cause of the persevering opposition of the Indians, who have nobly defended their country against our attempts to enforce a fraudulent treaty. The natives used every means to avoid a war, but were forced into it by the tyranny of our government." Unquote. Although Jackson had supported the state governments in their efforts to remove native tribes, he had strong ideas about the limits of state rights. This became clear during the nullification crisis. In 1828, Congress dramatically increased the amount of taxes imposed upon imports to shield domestic producers against foreign competition. Most goods imported into the country were manufactured items, so these taxes primarily benefited factory owners. Consumers of manufactured goods, such as farmers, were forced to pay higher prices. Since most Southerners were farmers, they were particularly alarmed at what they saw as an unfair favoring of one region over another. They referred to the new tax schedule as the Tariff of Abominations.